Hey there. Tonight, we begin beside a dark river, where mist clings to reeds, where mud remembers every footstep, and where a city that would one day command half the world is still nothing more than cold water, soft ground, and a place chosen by practical men with sharp eyes. The strange thing is that London did not begin with a grand trumpet call or a shining prophecy. It began with a crossing, a bridge, a wager against marsh and tide. And if that sounds almost disappointingly ordinary, stay with me, because that is how history likes to disguise itself. It hides inside useful things: a ford, a timber pile, a measured road, a crate unloaded from a boat. And before we settle in, do take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if these quiet walks through the past feel like home to you. Now let the room grow a little dimmer. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench the jaw. Breathe in slowly and imagine the breath of the river before dawn, cool and silver, moving over dark water. You are standing on the bank of the Thames long before anyone called it London, long before church bells and carriage wheels and soot and neon. There is only the hush of reeds, the soft complaint of water against mud, and a low sky that seems almost close enough to touch. Honestly, I have always found it strange that some of the greatest cities begin not with certainty, but with dampness, not marble, not destiny. Dampness, wet boots, shivering surveyors. The sort of beginning that would make no poet proud in the moment, but would quietly outlast poems anyway. Long before the city had walls, before forum stones and bathhouses and shouting merchants, this was a frontier edge of the world. The Romans had not yet sorted into columns and tax records. Britain was still a place of rumor to many of them, a place mentioned in campaign reports and political dreams, a damp island beyond the Channel where ambition looked colder than it did in Italy. Julius Caesar had come and gone generations earlier, glancing at the island like a man pressing his face to a locked window. He had crossed, fought, observed, and left behind not mastery, but appetite. Rome had looked at Britain and thought, not yet. So the river waited. If you were standing here with me, you would notice first that the land does not invite easy confidence. The bank near the future city is slick in places, firm in others. Pools collect in the low ground. Marsh grass bends in the breeze. The water smells of silt and distance. Somewhere in the trees, a bird gives a sharp call, then all goes quiet again. It is the kind of landscape that teaches patience. Step carelessly and the earth takes your ankle. Step wisely and it carries you. Then, in the first century after the birth of Christ, the waiting ends. In the year 43, Emperor Claudius sends the Roman army across the sea into Britain. They arrive with armor, discipline, bureaucracy, and perhaps most powerful of all, engineers. An empire can win with soldiers, of course, but it stays only when men arrive carrying measuring rods, axes, rope, and plans folded in their heads. I like to imagine those first Roman engineers squinting at the Thames in the early light. The soldiers are there, yes, restless and hard from travel. Officers on horseback study the bank, but the engineers are the ones doing the quieter magic. One kneels and presses his hand into the ground. Another watches how the current turns. Another studies the rise of land beyond the marsh. Their work is not dramatic. It is intimate. They are learning where weight will hold, where timber can be driven, where traffic can be controlled, where a bridge can force the world to begin behaving like a city. That crossing point matters more than any speech could. The Thames here is broad enough to carry trade, narrow enough to bridge, and deep enough to matter. It links inland routes to the sea. It lets men, animals, carts, and goods converge. It turns geography into advantage. The Romans understood that with the kind of dry clarity empires prize, soon the first structures begin. Imagine the sound of timber posts driven into the riverbed. Deep thuds, measured, repeated. A human heartbeat enlarged into architecture. Men shout in Latin over the river wind. Ropes creak. Wet wood shines darkly. Mud sucks at sandals and boots. Smoke rises from cook fires on the bank, carrying the smell of barley mash and charred meat into the damp morning air. A temporary camp becomes a work site, and the work site becomes the first rough promise of a town. This new settlement will be called Londinium. The exact origin of the name remains uncertain, which somehow feels appropriate. The city that will later be described so confidently begins with a word whose roots are still half hidden in fog. History is mischievous that way. It gives us monuments and withholds labels. At first, Londinium is less a grand city than a useful machine. Roads begin to press outward from it. Supplies move through it. Orders are carried to it. Barges nose along the river, loaded with grain, pottery, wine, oil, metalwork, cloth, tools, and people who did not expect their lives to change quite so much. Traders appear because traders always appear wherever profit can smell a future. Soldiers linger. Artisans stay. Clerks set down records. The place thickens. The bridge becomes its spine. There is something deeply Roman about that. They did not merely occupy landscapes. They pinned them down. A river that once wandered through marsh and memory now has a crossing. And that crossing becomes obligation. Traffic flows. Duties are collected. Distances shrink. An empire extends not by imagination alone, but by timber, stone, and repetitive labor under a wet sky. As Londinium grows, it begins to gather the familiar anatomy of a Roman town. Roads are cut straighter than the land ever intended. Drains are set. A forum rises, first modestly, then with increasing confidence. Warehouses line the riverfront. Workshops hum with activity. There are bathhouses where steam curls into the air and conversation mixes with splashing water. There are temples where Roman gods are honored beside older, local beliefs that do not vanish neatly, but linger, adapt, and watch. The Forum is the true pulse of the place. If you walk there in the middle of a busy day, you hear the empire speaking in many voices at once. Merchants from distant provinces bargain over price. A soldier jokes with a wine seller. A scribe scratches notes onto wax. A woman wrapped against the damp inspects a bolt of cloth, rubbing it between finger and thumb with practical suspicion. Somewhere nearby, someone is cheating at scales. Somewhere else, someone notices and pretends not to. The smells are almost a map by themselves. Fresh bread, wet leather, tallow smoke, fish from the river, imported oil, spices so faint and costly that they seem more like rumor than scent. Wool damp from the weather, human closeness, animal heat, hot metal from a smithy. The city is still young, but already it has begun the ancient urban habit of smelling simultaneously alive, prosperous, and slightly questionable. And yet that uncertainty is part of the charm. Early Londinium is not polished, Rome transplanted perfectly across the sea. It is Rome improvising, Rome adapting, the empire with mud on its hems. Grand ideals meet British weather, and the weather wins just enough to keep everyone humble. At the riverfront, the city feels almost feverish with purpose. Ships arrive and unload goods from across the Roman world. Amphorae are stacked. Crates are counted. Pack animals stamp and snort. River water slaps against timbers, blackened by wetness and use. A customs official looks very pleased with himself for reasons that are probably taxable. Life enters Londinium in fragments and leaves in profit. Its people come from many places. This is one of the quieter wonders of Roman London. It is not merely Romans and Britons facing each other across a divide. It is a more tangled, more human scene. Soldiers from one province serve beside administrators from another. Merchants drift in from Gaul, from Germany, from the Mediterranean. Enslaved people carry burdens not of their own choosing. Artisans bring techniques learned far from this river. Accents overlap. Customs rub against one another. In the markets and streets, the empire stops being an idea and becomes a crowd. For the wealthier inhabitants, life gathers around villas and comforts imported or imitated from warmer lands. Mosaic floors, fine pottery, private dining, political ambition dressed as hospitality. One can imagine a dinner in Roman London where a magistrate raises a cup and talks confidently about civilization, while outside the rain taps the shutters and the city smells of river mud. There is a bit of comedy in that. Rome always wanted its provinces to feel inevitable. Britain, I suspect, often preferred irony. For ordinary people, the city is harsher and busier. A workshop before dawn, a stall to maintain, a shipment to unload, a road to repair, children weaving through the legs of adults, dogs nosing at scraps, a pot of stew thickening by a fire, while smoke clings to beams overhead. The city feeds ambition, yes, but it also demands stamina. Londinium is an opportunity, and opportunities are rarely gentle. Still, it works. That is the important part. The town not only survives, it prospers. It becomes a key center of trade and administration in Roman Britain. Roads link it to the wider island. The bridge anchors movement. Wealth accumulates. Authority settles into place. What was once a clever crossing becomes a real urban organism. And I want to slow down here, because this is the first time London becomes recognizably itself. Not in architecture alone, not in politics, not even in name, but in temperament. Already the city is learning to make use of traffic, diversity, money, ambition, and inconvenience. Already, it is becoming a place where the world arrives muddy and leaves transformed. Walk with me now, beyond the market and toward the edge of the growing settlement. The ground is firmer here. Timber buildings stand close together. Smoke lifts in pale lines. A dog barks once, then loses interest. In the distance, the bridge carries a slow stream of movement. Carts, soldiers, traders, ordinary feet doing the ordinary things that eventually become history. The river keeps breathing beside it all, patient, unastonished. You know that feeling when a place seems to understand its future before the people in it do. That is Londinium now. Not grand enough to boast, not old enough to revere itself, but already fixed to a purpose. Its builders think they are solving practical problems, crossing water, moving goods, holding territory. But under their hands, they are also making a city that will spend 2,000 years learning how to burn, rebuild, expand, suffer, glitter, and begin again. Night comes early in these damp latitudes. As dusk settles, the bridge darkens into silhouette. Lamps appear one by one. Firelight wavers in windows and doorways. Voices soften. Somewhere in the settlement, a soldier laughs too loudly. Somewhere else, a woman hushes a child. The forum empties into shadow. The river catches the last light and then gives it back. The first London sleeps without knowing its own name, will endure the fall of empires. And yet beneath that sleep there is already tension, the kind that always gathers around wealth and conquest. Rome has planted its order here, but the island has not agreed to forget itself. Beyond the walls and roads, beyond the measured streets, resistance is breathing in the dark. Londinium is young, prosperous, and terribly visible. That is often the most dangerous thing a city can be. So let us stay near the fire for a moment longer and listen to the river moving past the timbers of that first bridge, because in the next hush, in the next turning of years, the city will discover something that London will have to learn again and again. To be important is to be fragile. To rise quickly is to invite flame. And somewhere beyond the roads, beyond the neat Roman confidence, history is already striking flint. Morning in Roman Londinium, begins before the light has fully gathered itself. The river is first to wake. It shifts and murmurs against the piers of the bridge, carrying weed, driftwood, and the smell of faraway places toward the city. Then the gulls begin. Then the wheels. Then the sandals and boots. Then the voices, not loud all at once, but layering one over another until the place sounds less like a settlement and more like a living engine. If you step into the streets at that hour, you can feel how quickly confidence has grown here. Timber houses stand shoulder to shoulder. Workshops open their shutters. Bakers lift warm loaves from ovens. Smiths test the day with the first bright strike of hammer on metal. Smoke rises from cook fires and roof vents, carrying with it the soft bitterness of charred wood and damp straw. The Forum is not yet crowded, but already a fruit seller is laying out his goods with the solemn seriousness of a priest arranging offerings. Cities are funny that way. They make rituals out of onions and ledger books. Londinium is no longer just a useful crossing. It is a place of habits now, and habits are where permanence begins. There are officials who complain about paperwork. There are laborers who know exactly which stones wobble in the street. There are children who cannot imagine the town as anything new, which is perhaps the surest sign that it has ceased to be temporary. By the middle decades of the 1st century, Roman London hums with trade and authority. The bridge ties north and south together. Roads pull goods in from the countryside and out toward other corners of Roman Britain. Warehouses along the river store wine, coil, grain, pottery, tools, and cloth. Coins change hands so often that fingers begin to smell faintly of copper. Taxation, military, supply, commerce, gossip, ceremony, appetite. All of it runs together until the city feels almost invincible. That illusion, of course, never lasts. But before we come to the burning, let us linger inside the Roman city at its height, because when a place is later reduced to ash, the small details matter even more. They are what the fire tries to erase. There is a bathhouse where steam clouds the air and beads on the skin of men talking business, as if heat itself can soften ambition. There are shrines where candles flicker before carved faces brought from older worlds. There are respectable houses where painted walls and mosaic floors attempt to persuade Britain to behave more like the Mediterranean. Outside one such house, a servant empties wastewater into the street with an expression that suggests this was not part of his childhood dream. The Forum, by noon, is a flood of motion. Traders from many provinces bargain with the quick impatience of people who have bargained all their lives. Soldiers move through the crowd with the easy arrogance of men wearing state violence on their belts. A local woman in a heavy cloak sells woven goods beside a merchant offering imported luxuries that smell faintly of hot sun and long journeys. A clerk bends over a wax tablet, scratching numbers into memory. Somewhere nearby, a thief is deciding whom to bless with personal attention. The city is also deeply unequal, though that is hardly unusual. Wealth gathers in certain rooms and districts. Comfort belongs more securely to some than others. The rich dine, recline, and complain artistically. The poor carry, mend, sweep, unload, stitch, and sleep too close to the smell of labor. Yet both are Londoners now, though no one would have used the word yet. Both are shaping the city, one through ownership, the other through exhaustion. If you were standing here with me, I think what would surprise you most is not the grandeur, but the closeness. Roman Londinium is not spacious in the way later centuries will prefer. It is tight, human, immediate. Goods stacked against walls, animals squeezed through lanes, smoke caught between buildings, snatches of laughter and arguments slipping through open doorways. The city is always near itself. One life presses against another. This closeness helps it thrive. It also helps it burn. The empire, for all its roads and rules, has not pacified Britain into perfect obedience. Beneath Roman administration, resentment lives, taxes wound, occupation humiliates, land changes hands, customs are pushed aside or translated into Roman convenience. There are tribes who accept, tribes who adapt, tribes who wait, and tribes who do not forgive. Among the latter is Boudica, queen of the Iceni. Her uprising in the year 60 is one of those moments when history seems to stop being paperwork and become weather. A force gathers beyond the city, tribal anger sharpened into movement. Roman confidence, so used to structuring the world, suddenly finds itself facing a wave it cannot easily order back into place. What happened next has echoed through the story of London ever since. Boudica and the forces aligned with her swept down upon the city, and Londinium, still young, still rising, still flush with commerce and Roman certainty, was abandoned to catastrophe. I want to slow this part down, because destruction in a city is never only the fall of buildings. It is also the breaking of routine, the interruption of ordinary gestures, a loaf left unbought, a ledger unfinished, a cup cooling on a table while its owner runs. That is the real horror of urban ruin. Not only flame, but the sudden cancellation of all the small assumptions that held the day together. So imagine the first rumors entering the city. A messenger arrives, winded and dust-streaked. Then another. Then faces begin to change. An officer speaks too quickly. A merchant closes his stall before noon. Someone says the rebels are farther away than feared. Someone else says they are closer. The river keeps moving, maddeningly calm. The bridge still stands. The forum still buzzes. But beneath it all, panic begins to find its footing. Then comes the break. The assault on Londinium is fast, brutal, and overwhelming. Later, Roman writers describe slaughter and destruction in terms meant to warn and astonish. But even without dwelling on the worst of it, the image is terrible enough. Streets that had been crowded with trade become corridors of flight. Doors are broken open. Roofs catch. Storehouses turn from wealth into fuel. Smoke thickens until direction itself begins to fail. The city, so recently proud of its organization, becomes a maze of heat. Fire in a timber city behaves like hunger. It finds seams and runs along them. It climbs beams, leaps alleys, and feeds on whatever human confidence has built too closely together. Londinium had grown quickly, perhaps too quickly for mercy. Warehouses full of goods, homes packed side by side, workshops with dry timber and oil, all of it waiting without knowing it to become one great offering to flame. The bridge, the river, the walls, none of these can give instant rescue to everyone. Some flee toward the water. Some try to carry valuables that will only slow them. Some lock doors, as if doors understand desperation. Some stand still too long, because the mind is not made to accept in a single minute that the world it knew at sunrise will be gone by night. You can see the fire in layers. First, the orange bite at a roofline, then the wider wash of red reflected in windows, then sparks blown sideways by wind, then smoke, turning daylight into a dim and bitter twilight. Then the larger roar that seems at first almost impossible, because no one expects a city itself to sound like an animal. And yet it does. It groans. It hisses. It cracks. It collapses inward with a noise that feels strangely personal. I have always found city fires unnerving in a very particular way. A forest burns and one feels the indifference of nature. A city burns and one feels the fragility of planning. All those measurements, all those records, all those walls and streets and names, and then one ember lands well, or badly, depending on your perspective, and the whole argument of permanence begins to come apart. As the revolt tears through Londinium, Roman order suffers not only physical defeat, but symbolic humiliation. This was to be a model of empire, a center of trade and control. Instead, it becomes a warning. The very visibility that made the city prosperous makes it a target. The very wealth that drew traders to it makes its destruction more shocking. Ash from fine goods and common goods falls alike. And then, after the flame, comes the quieter ruin. The city blackens. Charred beams jut from the ground at angles that seem almost theatrical in their despair. Stone that had seemed so solid is cracked by heat. Pottery shatters. The market is silent. The baths are cold. Streets, once full of voices, carry only the scrape of feet picking through debris. Smoke lingers in fabrics, in hair, in memory. River mist mixes with ash and makes the morning smell almost metallic. If you walk through Londinium, then, after the main destruction has passed, you would see something cities know too well. Emptiness with shape. The outline of a room without its life. A threshold leading nowhere. A section of wall still painted. A household object lying in open ground as if the building around it had simply forgotten its duty to exist. And yet even here, London begins to reveal the habit that will define it. It does not remain a ruin. That may sound inevitable from our distance, but it never is in the moment. There are always reasons not to rebuild. Cost, fear, political uncertainty, exhaustion, the possibility that another site might be safer, cleaner, easier. But Londinium is too useful to abandon for long. The crossing remains strategic. The river remains valuable. Roads still converge. Geography, that stubborn old accomplice of cities, continues making its case. So rebuilding begins. At first, it is not glorious. There is little glory in clearing debris. Men haul blackened beams aside. Stones are sorted. Foundations are inspected. Surviving goods are counted with a solemnity due to the nearly lost. Work crews move through the ruin with the patient dullness of people too tired for speeches. Rebuilding after fire is less like triumph and more like remembering how to use your hands. Still, there is hope in repetition. A measured line cut into the earth. A new timber lifted. A wall repaired. A drain reset. The same practical genius that founded the town now saves it. Roman administration, whatever else one may say about it, is good at returning to the task. There is paperwork, I am sure. There is always paperwork. Somewhere, an official is no doubt explaining catastrophe in triplicate. Yet beneath the bureaucracy, real labor takes hold, and the city begins its second life. This matters because the rebuilt Londinium is not merely restored. It is hardened in memory. Its people have seen how quickly security can fail. The rebuilt city carries beneath its pavements the ghost of fire. That memory does not disappear. It becomes part of the civic temperament. London learns early that prosperity is not a shield, only an invitation to vigilance. In the years that follow, Roman Londinium rises again. Trade returns. Streets fill. Temples stand. The bridge still binds movement across the Thames. The city remains a major center of commerce and administration in Roman Britain. Those who come later may admire walls and relics, but what is more impressive to me is the less visible thing, the insistence. This place keeps insisting on itself. By now, evening has settled over the river once more. In the rebuilt town, lamps shine again where darkness once carried only embers. Somewhere, a smith resumes work. Somewhere, a merchant complains about prices with the delicious confidence of a man who has survived. Somewhere, a child grows up never fully understanding that beneath his feet lie traces of the first city, burned but not erased. The Romans will not rule Britain forever. Their power will thin. Their walls will age. Their soldiers will leave. But Londinium, though changed again and again, will continue. It will carry the Roman imprint in roads, in trade habits, in stone, in ambition. It will outlive the order that made it. Cities often do. They are unfaithful children in that sense. They inherit, then improvise. Before we leave Roman London, let us stand one last time by the river at dusk. The Thames moves, as it always has. untroubled by empire. It saw the first bridge rise, saw the smoke of Boudica's revolt, saw rebuilding hands at work, and will watch long after Latin voices fade from these banks. The water reflects torchlight in broken lines. A barge shifts softly at its moorings. Somewhere beyond the roofs, the last light drains from the sky. And in that quiet there is a strange comfort. The city has already discovered its oldest law. London may be broken. It may be burned. It may be left to blackened silence. But if the river still runs, if the crossing still matters, if even a few hands remain willing to lift timber from ash, then the story does not end there. It changes shape. Soon enough, Rome itself will begin to loosen its grip, and the city that survived revolt will have to survive something slower and more haunting: the long fading of an empire. Walls will remain where certainty does not. Roads will outlast command. And Londinium, no longer quite Roman and not yet fully medieval, will stand in that dim threshold, waiting for the next people to inherit its stones. When Roman authority begins to thin, it does not vanish all at once. That would almost be kinder. Instead, it loosens, thread by thread, as if the empire has grown tired of holding the edge of the world together. Orders arrive more slowly. Troops become fewer. Maintenance falters. The great machine that once moved soldiers, tax collectors, engineers, and marble certainty across the map begins to stutter. Londinium feels this before it can name it. The streets still exist. The river still carries trade. The walls still stand in places, sober and practical against the damp air. But something in the mood of the city changes. Confidence becomes caution. Routine becomes improvisation. The markets continue because people must eat and buy and sell even while the larger frame around their lives weakens. Yet in the corners of the city, there is an unfamiliar silence. If you were walking here now, you might notice little things first. A public building not quite repaired. A stretch of road rougher than it should be. A storehouse less full than last season. A workshop closed. A family leaving rather than arriving. Empires rarely announce their fading with a trumpet. More often they reveal it in unattended drains and unanswered letters. By the early 5th century, Roman rule in Britain is withdrawing into itself. The island, once a province to be administered, becomes a problem to be abandoned. Soldiers are recalled. Local powers shift. The old guarantees no longer guarantee much. Londinium, built to serve an imperial world, finds itself staring into a strange new future where the roads remain, but the hand behind them has let go. Honestly, I have always thought this is one of the loneliest moments in the story of any city. Not the hour of invasion, because at least invasion is noisy and obvious. Not the hour of fire, because flame gives the mind something clear to fear. No, the loneliest moment is when a city realizes the system that made it powerful is quietly departing, and the people left behind must decide whether to pretend nothing has changed or begin with cold hands and uncertain sleep, to invent the next age. So London changes again. The Roman city contracts. Some spaces empty out. Grand public life grows dimmer. Certain buildings fall into disuse. Yet the place is not simply erased. It lingers. It settles into itself. The walls still shape movement. The river still breathes against the banks. The old stones remain where people can step over them, use them, lean new timber against them, remember them badly, and live beside them anyway. Across the following generations, Anglo-Saxon life begins to gather around and within the old Roman shell. This is not a clean replacement, not one world ending politely before another begins. It is a mixture, a layering, a patient untidiness. New settlers arrive. Roman habits survive in fragments. Old masonry becomes useful material. A wall once built for empire becomes a boundary for a market, a landmark for a traveler, a shelter from the wind. The city in this age is harder to see clearly because it no longer speaks in the self-assured tone of Roman administration. It speaks in scattered traces, in pottery shards, in changing burial customs, in charters and later chronicles, in the half-remembered shape of streets. But if you listen closely, you can still hear London continuing. There are homes pressed within old defenses. There are small communities working along the river. There are craftsmen hammering, mending, weaving, curing leather, and counting whatever coin or barter the age will allow. There are priests and kings, traders and ferrymen. There is mud, always mud. History likes to imagine itself in banners and decrees, but most of it happens in wet shoes. By the time we reach the reign of Alfred the Great in the late 9th century, London begins to sharpen once more into recognizability. Alfred, practical in the way that only men surrounded by danger can become, understands what the city means. Viking pressure has unsettled England. Old centers of power are vulnerable. Yet the Roman walls of London, weathered and damaged though they are, still offer a gift from the past, a ready-made skeleton for defense and urban revival. So the city is reoccupied, refortified, and given renewed purpose. Imagine that moment. Men clearing brush from the old walls, gates repaired, timber palisades reinforced, streets inside the circuit made useful again. The Roman city, which must have seemed at times like an aging shell left by ghosts, suddenly becomes alive with intention. A later age steps inside the bones of an earlier one and says, "Yes, this will do. We can make a city here again." That is one of London's oldest talents. It does not merely build. It reuse. It inherits. It takes ruins personally and turns them into groundwork. As trade gathers strength through the 10th century, London reemerges as a lively urban center. The city within the old Roman wall becomes a maze of lanes, workshops, dwellings, and marketplaces. The river draws merchants as surely as it always has. Goods move along the Thames and out toward the wider world. People from different regions come and go. The city is once more earning its restlessness. Walk through it now, and the sounds are different from Roman Londinium, but no less vivid. Hooves on packed ground, the creak of carts, bells from churches beginning to shape the rhythm of time, the rise and fall of barter in crowded markets, a butcher calling out prices, a child laughing until a mother decides the laugh has gone too far and catches him by the sleeve. Somewhere, a dog objects to everything for reasons known only to itself. Medieval London grows inside contrast. Wealth and want live near each other. Piety and commerce share walls. The city is full of devotion, but also full of bargaining, because the soul may aspire upward while the stomach remains interested in practical arrangements. Church spires rise, parish bells ring, priests chant, and at the same time, fishmongers, goldsmiths, bakers, and cloth merchants work with an intensity that feels almost liturgical in its own way. The markets are the true arteries of this age. Smithfield opens wide, with livestock and produce. Mud churned beneath hooves and boots. Cheapside brims with specialized trade. Its narrow space is alive with metalwork, luxury goods, shouting buyers, and that very old urban skill of pretending not to notice exactly how much your neighbor is making. London in these centuries is a city that smells strongly of commerce. Wool, meat, smoke, ale, wax, leather, whetstone, river road, bread. It is not delicate. It is alive. Guilds begin to shape much of the city's working life. Each craft protects its own standards, its own privileges, its own members. This gives London structure, but also a certain proud stubbornness. A city of guilds is a city of negotiated authority. Everyone has rank. Everyone has rules. Everyone also, naturally, has complaints. One can imagine a London guild meeting ending exactly as such meetings always end, with someone insisting tradition is collapsing and someone else muttering that tradition has been collapsing very comfortably for years. Religion sits at the center of all this. London is thick with churches. Their towers and bells and processions provide a kind of spiritual map over the city. St. Paul's Cathedral dominates the skyline, a vast statement of faith and prestige. Parish churches anchor neighborhoods. Monasteries and religious houses maintain rhythms of prayer, care, and authority. The city listens to bells the way a body listens to its own pulse. Morning, noon, evening, feast days, warnings, mourning, celebration. Sound orders time before clocks truly can. Yet beneath the piety, danger is never far. Medieval London is beautiful in the way old cities often are from a distance. Up close, it is more complicated. The streets are narrow, twisting, and often filthy. Waste does not always go where it should. Fire remains a constant fear. Crime finds plenty of corners. Night changes everything. A lane that seems merely crowded by day may become quietly menacing after sunset. A respectable doorway becomes a place to avoid. A figure standing too still in a shadow becomes a very persuasive argument for walking faster. And still, people love the city, or at least depend on it so deeply that the difference becomes academic. Then comes 1066, and with it, one of the great hinge moments in the history of England and of London. William, Duke of Normandy, defeats Harold at Hastings and moves to claim the kingdom. London, wealthy, symbolic, difficult, and necessary, lies before him. No ruler can truly possess England without securing this city. William enters not simply as conqueror, but as a man who understands theater. He knows that power must be seen as well as exercised. So after his coronation, on Christmas Day 1066, the city begins to feel the full weight of Norman rule. Fortifications rise. Administration tightens. New elites settle in. French and Latin press upon an already crowded linguistic world. London becomes the capital of a conquered kingdom, learning how to call itself one nation under new masters. The most visible expression of this new order is the Tower of London. Let us walk toward it slowly. You see it first not as the museum image later centuries will know, but as an assertion. Stone against uncertainty. A fortress on the Thames, built to dominate, defend, and remind. William orders its construction because he is clever enough to understand that cities do not always love the men who rule them, and London in particular has a mind of its own. The tower is therefore not only a residence or military structure, it is a message in masonry. Obey. The white tower rises with grim grace, its Norman form severe and confident. It watches the river. It watches the city. It becomes part fortress, part royal residence, part treasury, to part prison, part warning. London will spend centuries looking at it and understanding that government, however crowned, likes to keep a harder face in reserve. If you stand near it in the cool morning air, you can smell the river and damp stone together. The walls feel massive, in a way timber never can. Sound changes near such a building. Footsteps echo differently. Voices shrink a little. Even birds seem to cross above it with professional discretion. A fortress teaches the air around it to behave. And across the Thames, another great center of power gathers its own gravity. Westminster Abbey, older in spiritual importance and later monumental in stone, becomes the companion presence to the tower. If the tower speaks of force and kingship, Westminster speaks of sanctity, legitimacy, and ceremony. Coronations, burials, national memory, all begin to collect there. London, in this medieval shape, becomes a city balanced between sword and prayer, between the hard wall and the holy arch. I have always found that pairing very London. Power in one hand, ritual in the other. Fear on one bank, reverence on the other. A city learning that authority must both threaten and bless, under Norman, and later, medieval rule, London grows steadily. Trade expands. Population rise. Houses press tighter together. Wooden upper stories lean over streets as if trying to overhear one another. Bridges, wharves, halls, churches, and markets multiply. The city within the walls becomes dense with labor and hope. Beyond the walls, suburbs and liberties gather around the edges. London no longer feels like a revived town. It feels like a force, and yet it remains deeply human in all the least glamorous ways. There are apprentices carrying goods too heavy for their age, housewives haggling with the sort of precise fury that no king has ever successfully subdued, monks trying to maintain dignity while city life insists on dripping, shouting, and smelling nearby. Noblemen riding through streets that would frankly prefer they were elsewhere. Beggars at church doors. Foreign merchants at inns. Street children who know more of the city by instinct than any map could teach. By the 13th century, London is central enough to the kingdom that its rights and liberties matter to national politics. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, confirms many rights, and among them is recognition of London's ancient liberties and customs. This is not just legal texture. It tells us something important. London is no longer merely a place to rule. It is a place with bargaining power, a city with money, trade, and institutional memory becomes difficult to ignore. And even kings prefer not to quarrel too carelessly with the goose that provides a considerable number of administrative eggs. Still, the city remains unequal and uneasy. Splendor and squalor coexist. Great religious houses stand not far from crowded lanes. Merchant wealth grows. Poverty persists. Disease is always a possibility. Fire never truly sleeps. Yet the city keeps expanding its habits of self-organization and self-regard. It becomes more than a collection of structures. It becomes a civic personality. And as the evening falls on medieval London, the city sounds different from Roman London, but no less full. Bells toll over the roofs. Taverns warm with talk. Candles flicker in shuttered windows. Somewhere a monk bends over text in careful light. Somewhere a watchman calls the hour. Somewhere in the tower a prisoner listens to the river and wonders how long stone can feel like time. The streets narrow into shadow. The market stalls fall quiet. Smoke settles low. The old Roman walls remain beneath newer lives, and the Norman stone of the tower watches over them all. London now is no longer the city of the Caesars, yet not fully the city of later kings either. It is something layered and restless, a place continually teaching itself how to survive change by absorbing it. And before long, another age will arrive with even sharper ambition. Courts will glitter. Palaces will swell. Religion will crack apart. Heads will fall. The city that learned to live between wall and market, tower and abbey, will next have to learn what happens when royal desire itself begins to remake the soul of England. The next London arrives in silk, suspicion, aisance, and argument. By the time the Tudor age gathers itself over the city, London is no longer simply an old medieval capital. It is becoming something louder, richer, and far more dangerous to live near if one happens to stand too close to power. The streets still twist and crowd. Markets still roar. Church bells still rule the hours. But now, the city is also thick with courtly ambition, royal spectacle, whispered theology, and the peculiar instability created when a king decides that his private life ought to rearrange a nation. If you were standing here with me, near Whitehall, on a damp morning in the early 16th century, you would feel the change almost physically. Horses splash through filth, while courtiers in fine fabrics pass above it all with expressions of exquisite concern. Barges move on the Thames carrying officials. Is the Eldian hivement, messengers, and gossip in equal measure. Palaces swell with rooms, galleries, kitchens, and administrative offices. The city has always had wealth and rank, but now the royal court gathers around it with a brightness that feels a little feverish. Henry VIII sits at the center of much of this fever. He is large in appetite, large in will, large in consequence. Under him, London becomes not only the capital of government and trade, but the stage upon which dynastic worry, religious rupture, and political theater perform themselves day after day. Honestly, Henry always strikes me as the sort of man who could make even breakfast feel constitutional. When a ruler like that wants something, the city trembles because it understands, perhaps before the ruler does, that private desire can become public damage very quickly. Whitehall Palace becomes the great hive of Tudor authority. Its chambers fill with advisors, petitioners, noblemen, spies, musicians, clerks, and men whose entire profession seems to consist of standing in the right room at the right moment, looking indispensable. The king receives ambassadors. Decisions are made. Alliances form and unform. The air smells of wax, rushes, roast meat, perfumi, damp wool, and nerves. London itself absorbs this royal intensity. Taverns and streets carry rumor faster than horses. Markets buzz with news from court. In churchyards and workshops, people speak softly about marriages, annulments, papal authority, succession, and danger. A city close to power becomes expert in overhearing itself. Then comes the great break with Rome. Frustrated that the Pope will not grant the annulment he desires, Henry turns England away from papal authority and declares himself supreme head of the Church of England. It is one of those moments in history that can sound tidy when summarized and feel terrifying when lived. A sentence in a textbook, a thunderclap in a street. For London, the change is not abstract. It reaches into stone, ritual, property, and conscience. Monasteries are dissolved, their lands and wealth seized. Shrines are dismantled. Old devotions are denounced or revised. St. Paul's, once a center of Catholic worship within the city's breathing heart, begins to sound with Protestant preaching. Priests adapt, resist, or disappear. The city becomes a field of argument disguised as architecture. Walk through London in those years and you would sense the unease everywhere. A parishioner glances toward a familiar altar and wonders whether it will still be there next season. A former monk tries to decide what life means outside a dissolved house. A merchant sees opportunity in redistributed lands and says little about doctrine. A printer knows that paper can become a weapon. A preacher raises his voice. A listener lowers his. The Reformation changes the city materially as well as spiritually. Monastic lands come onto the market. Wealth moves. New elites rise. The merchant class grows in influence. London, already inclined toward trade, becomes even more deeply tied to financial energy and civic ambition. Religion tears at the soul of the nation. Yes, but it also rearranges property lines. And property lines have a way of surviving theology with remarkable confidence. Still, not everyone bends. The Tower of London, already old and grimly versatile by this point, takes on renewed significance as a place where political and religious conflict can be converted into stone confinement. Heretics, traitors, rivals, doubters, the categories overlap more than one might hope. The tower is not merely a prison. It is the physical punctuation mark at the end of royal displeasure. And inside the orbit of that displeasure, one woman stands in particular brightness and peril. Anne Boleyn. Her rise is one of the most famous and uneasy ascents in English history. She begins not as a queen, but as a presence, clever, magnetic, difficult to ignore, difficult to possess. Henry desires her, pursues her, and in pursuing her helps tear England away from Rome. For a time she stands at the center of a transformed world, queen consort, mother of the future Elizabeth, embodiment of royal victory over obstacles that looked immovable. But courts love reversals almost as much as they love ceremony. Anne fails to give Henry the son he longs for. Enemies gather. Factions turn. Accusations bloom with unnatural speed. Adultery, incest, treason, charges so grave and so terrible that even now they carry the chill of something constructed for effect as much as justice. She is tried, condemned, and in May 1536 brought to the Tower Green within the walls of the fortress that had watched London for centuries. Let us stand there for a moment without turning it harsh. The air is cool. The grass inside the Tower precinct is unnervingly calm. Stone surrounds the place with its old indifference. Officials murmur. Witnesses wait. And whatever she feels within herself is remembered for composure. That is often what history preserves of the doomed, not the terror, which is private, but the posture, which is visible. Her death becomes more than the fall of a queen. It becomes a signal to the whole city that favor can vanish, that intimacy with power can be more fatal than distance from it, and that the machinery of Tudor monarchy once in motion, does not stop because pity knocks gently at the door. London hears that signal well. The city continues to thrive, but it thrives under tension. Under Edward VI, Protestant reform deepens. Under Mary I, Catholic restoration returns with force, and Protestant London feels fear closing around it again. Burnings take place. Conscience becomes combustible. Under Elizabeth I, settlement of a kind is restored, and London flourishes with a confidence that is both artistic and commercial. Yet even under Elizabeth, there remains that old edge, the sense that this city has lived too close to political weather to trust sunshine completely. And what sunshine there is comes in remarkable forms. Theaters rise. Playhouses gather crowds. South of the river, beyond the tighter moral grip of the city authorities, stages hum with language and invention. The Globe becomes one of the bright houses of this new London. There, among orange peels, laughter, jostling bodies, and the smell of ale, Shakespeare and his fellows turn ambition, grief, jealousy, love, and mortality into spoken music. It is one of the city's grandest paradoxes that, while faith fractures and power terrifies, art thrives. Perhaps that is not a paradox at all. Perhaps pressure always seeks a song. Walk through Elizabethan London, and you can hear many kinds of brilliance at once. In one lane, a printer sets type. In another, a sailor unloads goods from farther seas. At court, a diplomat lies politely. At the theater, a clown tells the truth in disguise. St. Paul's churchyard fills with booksellers and debate. The river, as ever, binds it all together, carrying nobles, players, merchants, laborers, and those who simply wish to arrive somewhere else with as little rain as possible. Then the centuries turn. London grows richer, denser, and more combustible. Timber houses crowd one another. Lanes remain narrow. Warehouses swell with goods. Shops and dwellings lean close enough for flame to feel almost social. The city is prosperous, yes, but also vulnerable in exactly the way old successful cities often are. Too much value, packed too tightly. Too much wood. Too much habit. Too much confidence that tomorrow will resemble today. By 1666, after plague has already bruised the city and left grief moving like a shadow through ordinary life, London stands ready for catastrophe without knowing it. It begins in the simplest and most treacherous way. A bakery on Pudding Lane. A spark. Heat. Dry timber. Wind. The Great Fire of London is one of those events so famous that people can forget how intimate it was for those inside it. Not abstract disaster. Not symbol. Heat at the edge of the room. Smoke where air should be. The sudden knowledge that the street you know by heart has become a trap. At first, the fire is local. Then not. It catches along roofs, walls, beams, warehouses, shops, and houses pressed close by habit and by centuries of insufficient urban generosity, the city burns the way only a crowded wooden city can burn, with speed that feels almost insulted by human efforts to stop it. Imagine London that night. The wind does the real governing now. Sparks fly, roofs catch, flames move above heads faster than feet can run below them. Church bells ring alarms. People drag possessions into the street with the sort of tragic selectiveness disaster enforces. A guest, a child, account books, bedding, plate, whatever can be seized before the next roar of flame says no, not that too. Carts jam the lanes. The riverfront fills with those trying to load goods onto boats or simply flee. The sky turns red enough to look unreal. One of the darkest things about city fires is that they reorder value instantly. A house becomes fuel. A shop becomes smoke. A church becomes a chimney. An heirloom becomes weight. A lifetime of accumulation becomes a question of what can be carried in one trip by shaking hands. The fire takes hold of London with astonishing appetite. St. Paul's Cathedral, not yet the later Wren masterpiece the modern city knows, is consumed when its vast old structure gives itself to the blaze. Markets, halls, churches, homes, shops, everything seems to pass from usefulness to ruin in a single hot breath. Firefighting is primitive, fragmented, and overwhelmed. There is water, yes, but not enough organization, not enough pressure, not enough room, not enough time. You know that feeling when a city seems too large to fail? The Great Fire teaches the opposite. It teaches that if streets are narrow enough, and buildings close enough, and decisions slow enough, a metropolis can become one long torch laid across the riverbank. And yet, because this is London, there is stubbornness even here. Citizens fight the blaze where they can. Fire hooks pull at structures. Buckets pass from hand to hand. Orders are argued over, delayed, corrected, too late, then finally sharpened into the use of fire breaks, demolishing buildings ahead of the flames to deny them more food. The city loses enormous swathes of itself, but not its will to remain a city. By the time the fire is finally mastered, much of old medieval London lies ruined. Thousands are homeless. The familiar maze inside the old city has become black ground, broken walls, and ash underfoot. And there comes that haunted moment all great cities know after catastrophe, when smoke still lingers, when people stand where streets used to feel certain, and no one is yet brave enough to call the destruction the beginning of anything. But it is. Christopher Wren and others imagine new plans. Some are too grand to be fully realized, but the essential transformation does occur. London will rebuild in brick and stone. Streets will open. Certain medieval congestions will not return in the same way. Churches rise anew. St. Paul's will be reborn in a dome that becomes one of the city's great signatures. Out of the ruin, modern London begins to take a more recognizable shape. I have always thought there is something almost unfairly poetic in that. The old city burns, and from its ashes comes a calmer geometry. Not perfect, never perfect, because London does not truly believe in perfection, but broader, stronger, more fire aware. The city learns again through loss. And this is where part 4 of London's long story leaves us. In smoke and rebuilding, in grief and brick dust, in the aftermath of royal centuries that tore at conscience and power alike. The city that began as a Roman crossing has now survived empire, fading, conquest, a form, execution, plague, and flame. It has prayed, traded, argued, and burned. It has listened to kings and outlasted them. It has watched queens rise and fall. It has turned cathedrals into symbols, palaces into engines, towers into warnings. Night settles over the ruined and rebuilding city alike. Somewhere a mason studies fresh stone. Somewhere a family sleeps uneasily under temporary shelter while imagining walls not yet rebuilt. Somewhere the river moves past the blackened edges of wharves and remembers every version of London at once. And soon that river will watch the city do something new again. It will watch London grow into imperial wealth, industrial smoke, and a scale no medieval citizen could have dreamed. The old bells will not vanish, but they will have to compete with engines, railways, and the hard metallic rhythm of a much larger age. By the time London enters the age of empire, it no longer feels like a city that simply sits beside a river and waits for trade to come drifting toward it. It feels like a city tugging at the world. The Thames is still there, broad and brown and patient under the weather, but now it carries a different weight. Ships come and go with cargoes from distant coasts, and the docks speak in accents gathered from everywhere the empire has reached, and everywhere it has wounded, and everywhere it has taken. If you were standing on the river in the late 18th or 19th century, perhaps on a damp morning when the fog hangs low and the air tastes faintly of coal, you would feel that London has grown too large to think of itself as merely English. It is British, imperial, commercial, hungry. It counts. It ensures. It measures. It extracts. It consumes. It dreams in ledgers and smokestacks. The Industrial Revolution changes the city not in one neat burst, but in waves of iron, steam, labor, noise, and ambition. Factories multiply. Workshops swell into larger systems of production. Canals and river traffic feed the machinery. Then the railways arrive and tighten the pace of life so dramatically that the whole city seems to begin breathing faster. The old London of guilds, narrow medieval commerce, and local rhythms does not disappear completely. London rarely throws away an earlier self. It layers. It adds. It keeps old streets while building new stations, keeps church towers while lifting chimneys higher beside them. Yet the balance changes. Industry and finance begin to dominate the city's identity. The soundscape shifts. Bells still ring, but now they compete with wheels, hammers, Engines, whistles, hooves, and later the shriek and thunder of trains. Honestly, the railway age is one of the strangest transformations in the whole London story. For centuries, the city had grown outward in a more organic way, spreading through lanes and roads and river movement. Then suddenly, iron lines begin to stitch and cut through it. Stations such as Paddington, King's Cross, and Euston become not merely points of arrival, but cathedrals of movement. Their roofs gather soot and ambition in equal quantities. Their platforms inhale rural migrants, merchants, soldiers, clerks, dreamers, runaways, and those solemn men who appear to have been born already annoyed with luggage. The railways do more than move bodies. They rearrange the city's imagination. Distance shrinks. Suburbs become practical. Time becomes stricter. Schedules gain authority. London grows not only in population but in tempo. A city that once pulsed now begins to pound. And with that pounding comes wealth on an extraordinary scale. The British Empire pours goods, capital, people, and influence into London. The city becomes the administrative and financial heart of a sprawling imperial network. Docks along the river process tea, sugar, timber, spices, textiles, tobacco, and countless other commodities. Warehouses rise in hard rectangular confidence. Counting houses fill with clerks. Insurance firms, banks, and mercantile offices gather in the city, turning older streets into channels for global money. It is a dazzling thing from a distance. It is also a brutal thing if you stand too close to its foundations. Because London's rise in this period is built not only on ingenuity and trade, but also on extraction, exploitation, and empire. Wealth gleams in Mayfair because labor is exhausted elsewhere. Fine houses grow bright because colonies are made to yield. Drawing rooms sparkle because the machinery of the wider world has been arranged to direct value inward. The city, so often admirable in resilience, becomes in this era deeply implicated in dominion. Still, for those living within it, the city can feel intoxicating. Mayfair develops into a district of money and polish. Streets there carry a hush different from the old city. Carriages roll past elegant houses. Clubs cultivate discretion, exclusivity, and the sort of upholstered confidence that suggests history was invented largely to provide a background for luncheon. Not far away, Kensington expands with a slightly different but related grace. Garden squares, terraces, cultural institutions, and a growing aura of respectable prosperity. Walk there in the 19th century, and the surfaces seem composed. Facades align. Green spaces soften the edges. Servants move through back entrances. Ladies visit shops. Gentlemen discuss politics with practiced wariness. Artists and intellectuals drift in and out. Museums and galleries begin to help shape the district into a place where wealth and culture agree to flatter each other. Yet beyond these polished quarters, industrial London offers another face entirely. Working-class districts crowd and strain under the pressure of growth. Housing becomes dense, then overdense, then almost unbearably compressed. Streets blacken with soot. Air thickens with coal smoke. Water is not always clean. Disease moves quickly, where bodies are packed close. Children work. Women labor long hours. Men age fast under industrial routine. The city can offer employment, yes, but it can also grind a person down until the distinction between earning a living and wearing one out becomes painfully narrow. If you walk the poorer districts at dawn, you smell damp brick, chimney smoke, horse manure, frying fat, river rot, and human fatigue. Windows glow weakly. Factory shifts begin. Boots strike pavement with dull purpose. Laundry hangs where it can. Somewhere a baby cries. Somewhere someone coughs the deep cough of bad air and too many winters. Somewhere a woman scrubs a doorstep, because if the city insists on being filthy, then decency must at least make a gesture. This is Victorian London at its hardest and most memorable. Enormous wealth beside severe want. Grandeur beside soot. Reforming optimism beside structural misery. It is no wonder Dickens found so much to see here. A city so large and unequal becomes a theater where virtue, greed, neglect, charity, sentiment, and absurdity all shove past one another in the same lane. And Dickens is not alone. Victorian London produces writers, reformers, journalists, investigators, and artists, because the city all but demands witnesses. You cannot live amid so much contradiction without either turning away or trying to describe it. The slums, the counting houses, the prisons, the courts, the parks, the music halls, the clubs, the gin shops, the docks, the schools, the parlors, the workhouses, all of them ask to be recorded by someone with enough nerve and enough paper. At the same time, London also becomes a city of exhibitions and confidence. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in Hyde Park, gathers the empire's goods and the industrial age's inventions under glass in the Crystal Palace. It is one of those moments when a civilization looks at itself and says, with remarkable certainty, "See how advanced we are." Machines gleam. Craftsmanship dazzles. Crowds pour through. The city celebrates innovation, manufacture, and imperial reach with the polished excitement of a host who has decided not to mention the state of the kitchen. I do not say that to be unkind. Every great city has its pageants of self-admiration. London merely performs them on a vast scale. There is another side to industrial London that does not always appear in the grand narrative of empire and invention. And that is the simple bodily experience of living inside it. Soot settles on windowsills. Laundry hung out with hope comes back darker than it left. Faces at the end of a workday carry a grayness that seems less like dust and more like citizenship. The city stains what it touches. Even the fog begins to feel complicit, folding smoke into itself until the air becomes something one moves through rather than breathes. Yet amid all this, London keeps making places of beauty. Parks open out like pauses in a sentence that had almost grown too long to bear. Hyde Park, Kensington Gardens, green spaces around expanding districts. They offer the city moments in which the eye can rest. Children run, carriages pass, nurses push prams. Old men stare at water with the seriousness of philosophers who have survived enough to know the ducks are not the whole point. The contrast matters. A city so dense with labor needs open ground the way lungs need air. You can feel the same contrast along the embankment, where engineering and display work together to make the river seem more orderly than it really is. Stone, lamps, broad walks, all of it saying that London is not merely growing, but refining itself. And perhaps it is. But refinement in London has always sat beside strain. One district acquires trees and terraces, while another acquires more bodies per room. One household studies opera programs, while another studies the price of bread with the concentration of a military campaign. The miracle is not that the city contains opposites. The miracle is that it can contain so many at once without splitting cleanly in two. Queen Victoria presides over much of this century in a way that makes her seem less like a ruler at times and more like a weather system. Her reign is long enough that the city changes repeatedly beneath her name. Under Victoria, London becomes even more fully the symbolic center of Imperial Britain. It is a capital city, swollen with administration, ceremony, and global consequence. Crowds gather for jubilees. Official buildings multiply their authority. The monarchy, once merely powerful, becomes carefully theatrical in new ways. Yet even amid royal symbolism, the city remains a practical beast. Food must still arrive. Streets must still be crossed. Water must be managed. Bodies must be buried. Trains must run. And because London is so large, all practical problems become epic in scale. Sanitation crise, overcrowding, pollution, transportation pressures, all of them mount as the city grows. Progress, London discovers, is rarely tidy. It solves one difficulty by inventing 3 fresh ones, then congratulates itself while drafting a committee. Still, the energy of the place is undeniable. The West End grows brighter with theaters, shops, restaurants, and nightlife. The East End hums with docks, labor, migration, hardship, and tenacity. The city hardens into a financial district whose influence reaches far beyond the visible streets. Parliament, the law courts, and government offices help shape a national life concentrated within this one restless metropolis. And everywhere there is movement. Cabs, omnibuses, carts, trains, barges, pedestrians, clerks, flower sellers, errand boys, policemen, beggars, bankers, news vendors. London in this age does not stroll. It surges. By the late 19th century, The city has also become more self-conscious about its own image. It knows it is watched. It knows travelers write about it. It knows foreigners admire and fear it. It knows the empire radiates outward from these streets and offices. So, London becomes increasingly invested in being impressive. Public buildings, museums, monuments, bridges, embankments, all contribute to a carefully managed sense of metropolitan greatness. And yet, beneath the grandeur, there remains fragility. Poverty does not vanish because the empire is rich. Industrial success does not soften every life. Social reform movements arise precisely because the city produces such glaring evidence of neglect. Campaigns for workers' rights, better housing, sanitation reform, education, and representation gather momentum. London is too full of suffering to be governed entirely by complacency. One can build grand terraces all day, but eventually, the facts of the slum come knocking, usually with statistics and a smell no ministry can politely ignore. Then, the 20th century approaches, and with it, a change in tone. Imperial confidence remains, but it is increasingly shadowed by anxiety. New technologies alter communication and transport even further. Global rivalry sharpens. Political tensions gather. London still sees itself as the center of a vast order, but the world around that order is becoming less obedient. The city enters the new century powerful, crowded, unequal, inventive, and more vulnerable than it quite wishes to admit. Queen Victoria dies in 1901, and an era closes with her. Yet the London she leaves behind is immense, imperial, industrial, and humming with unresolved momentum. Its streets carry the memory of Roman roads, medieval lanes, Tudor anxieties, and post-fire brick, but now also rail lines, telegraphs, electric lights, and the pressure of modernity. It is a city at the height of one kind of greatness and on the edge of a century that will wound it repeatedly. If you pause by the Thames at dusk in those years, the river reflects lamps and warehouses and bridges, and smoke softened into evening haze. The water looks almost calm. Barges drift. Bells carry faintly. Somewhere, a train crosses. Somewhere in the darkening city, a factory horn sounds the end of a shift. Somewhere, a woman in Mayfair draws curtains against the night, while in the East End, another woman lights a lamp and wonders whether tomorrow will leave enough for rent. This is London before the wars, before the bomb blasts and blackout curtains and underground shelters, before the old imperial certainty is tested by mechanized destruction from the sky. The city glows. The city boasts. The city labors. The city expands. It looks almost invincible in its own smoke. And that, perhaps, is always when history begins quietly reaching for the match. When war comes to London in the 20th century, it does not arrive as a distant rumor for long. It arrives with uniforms in the streets, hospitals filling, trains carrying soldiers away, women taking on labor the city had once preferred not to notice they could do, and a low tightening in daily life that says the old normal has already begun slipping out of reach. The First World War changes London even before bombs fall upon it. The city becomes administrative nerve center, military depot, manufacturing engine, an emotional reservoir for a conflict whose front lines lie elsewhere, but whose grief reaches home with unbearable efficiency. Men enlist. Posters bloom on walls. Railway stations become theaters of departure. Families wait under clocks and smoke-stained roofs, while sons, husbands, brothers, and sweethearts step into trains that seem to carry ordinary faces toward industrial slaughter. If you stand at one of those stations in 1914, perhaps King's Cross or Paddington, you hear everything too loudly. Porters shouting, steam releasing in harsh sighs, boots on stone, nervous laughter, the language of farewell trying not to sound like farewell. London knows something vast has begun, even if it cannot yet imagine just how mercilessly the century means to introduce itself. As the war grinds on, the city changes. Hospitals fill. Offices process casualty lists and supply figures. Factories turn toward munitions. Rationing and shortages begin to bite. The old rhythms of urban life remain visible, but they now move under strain, as if every street carries a hidden second life made of waiting and dread. Then London learns something new and terrible. Distance is no longer protection. German Zeppelin raids and later bomber attacks bring the war into the city from the sky. It is one thing to read about battlefields far away. It is another to hear engines overhead at night and realize that the home front is now merely another target. The first bombings in the First World War are not yet the total urban devastation of later decades, but they introduce a new psychological reality. Civilians are vulnerable. The city itself can be reached. That knowledge never quite leaves. After the armistice, London returns, but not unchanged. The dead are too many, the wounded too visible. The old imperial confidence has acquired cracks. Memorials rise. Names are carved into stone. Families go on living because what else can they do? Yet the city carries a softer sadness in certain corners. You can feel it especially in the pauses, in the way remembrance settles over November air, in the black clothing some widows continue to wear, in the generation that has learned too early that modern progress is perfectly capable of designing modern ruin. Still, London remains London. Buses run. Shops reopen. Crowds fill streets. Music halls brighten evenings. Politics grow louder. New fashions appear. New neighborhoods stretch outward. The city moves into the interwar years with a mixture of fatigue and appetite, trying at once to remember and to forget. Then the 1930s darken. The threat from Europe thickens. News comes from abroad with a heavy taste of warning. Rearmament begins. Air raid planning expands. Shelters are discussed. Gas masks are prepared. There is a dreadful familiarity to it all. Except now, the scale promises to be far worse. Londoners live under the growing sense that the next war will not politely spare cities. When the Second World War begins in 1939, that sense hardens into reality. Yet the full ordeal for London arrives in 1940, when the Luftwaffe turns sustained attention toward the capital and the Blitz begins. If you were here on the evening of September 7, 1940, you would first notice a change in the sky. Not metaphorically, literally. Engines, many of them, a different vibration in the air. Then sirens. Then anti-aircraft fire. Then the city, which has known fire before, begins to learn what industrialized fire from above truly means. The East End is hit hard first, especially the docks. That is not accidental. The river has always been London's advantage, and now it becomes a line of vulnerability. Warehouses burn. Wharves erupt. Smoke and flame reflect on the Thames in long, violent smears. Entire neighborhoods are thrown into terror and urgent motion. Families run for shelter. Fire crews race towards scenes already overtaking them. Rescue workers dig where buildings have collapsed. Wardens knock, shout, count, guide, reassure, and sometimes simply witness. Night after night, the raids continue. This is the part of London's history that often becomes simplified into stoicism, Churchillian phrases, and posters about calm. There was courage, yes. There was solidarity, yes. But there was also fear, shock, exhaustion, confusion, grief, anger, and the physical misery of broken sleep. To romanticize the Blitz too much is to forget that the people living through it were not symbols. They were cold, frightened, brave, ordinary human beings trying to stay alive while the city around them burned. And still, bravery matters. Londoners shelter in underground stations, cellars, basements, and public refuges. Platforms that once served commuters now become temporary dormitories of wartime survival. Blankets are spread. Children sleep in awkward clusters. Tea is shared. Songs rise now and then. The smell is part metal, part damp wool, part fatigue. Trains still move where they can, and above them, the city takes blast after blast. You know that feeling when a place designed for one purpose is suddenly forced to become something more intimate. That is, the underground in the Blitz. It becomes shelter, community, nursery, chapel, waiting room, and quiet theater of endurance. People read. People doze. People talk in murmurs. People listen to the muted thunder above and pretend not to count how close it sounds this time. On the surface, destruction spreads through the city. Streets are torn open. Houses collapse. Office buildings burn. Churches are hit. Shops vanish. Dust coats everything. Water mains burst. Glass litters the pavements. The city acquires strange absences where familiar structures stood only hours before. Someone turns a corner expecting a terrace, a warehouse, a chapelle, a row of shops. and finds instead broken brick, steam, and moonlight falling on rubble. St. Paul's Cathedral becomes one of the great symbols of this struggle. Surrounded by destruction, threatened repeatedly by incendiary bombs and nearby blasts, it remains standing. The image of its dome rising through smoke becomes more than architecture. It becomes morale in stone. Fire watchers and crews labor to save it because they understand that if such a building falls, something psychological may fall with it. I have always thought it is important to remember that symbols are not magic by themselves. They survive because people decide to risk themselves for them. Men on cathedral roofs in burning nights, exhausted crews in choking smoke, wardens and firefighters doing work too dangerous for poetry to contain cleanly. They are the reason a symbol remains available to history afterward. And while St. Paul's stands, other places do not. Whole streets disappear. The East End suffers enormously. The city is hit. The West End is struck. Buckingham Palace is damaged. London Bridge is threatened. Schools, homes, hospitals, workshops, all are vulnerable. There is no elegant way for a city to absorb bombardment. There is only the practical and emotional labor of surviving it one night at a time. Then there is the sky battle above all this. The Battle of Britain is fought not only over open countryside but in the air around the capital itself. RAF pilots rise against the Luftwaffe in encounters whose speed and violence are difficult to fully imagine from the ground. Londoners look up between sirens and smoke and see contrails. Aircraft, falling fire, fragments of fights carried out at impossible height and terrifying consequence. The city learns to live under the knowledge that its fate is bound to young men in cockpits making split-second decisions over cloud and flame. Churchill, for all his grand rhetoric, matters here because words in such periods are also infrastructure. A city under bombardment requires not just shelters and water and fire engines, but language sturdy enough to organize feeling. His speeches help provide that. Yet the deeper infrastructure of endurance remains communal. Neighbors checking on neighbors, volunteers clearing debris, women running canteens, doctors and nurses working through impossible schedules, firefighters blackened with soot, children evacuated, then returned, then unsettled again. Survival in London is collective before it is heroic. By 1941, the worst of the sustained Blitz has eased, though danger does not vanish. The city has been marked deeply. But London, as so often before, does not stop being London merely because history has tried another harsh experiment upon it. Shops reopen where they can. Buses run around craters. Theaters continue in altered form. Offices adapt. People marry, grieve, cook, argue, laugh, and carry on because daily life is itself an act of resistance when annihilation has failed to achieve its timetable. The war continues. Then finally, after years of struggle, it ends. What remains is a city bruised, damaged, proud, exhausted, and uncertain about the future. Victory is real, but so is loss. Entire areas need rebuilding. Families are altered forever. The built fabric of London has holes in it, some physical, some emotional. Yet, as after the Great Fire, the city turns almost immediately toward reconstruction. It has done this before, though never after mechanized warfare on such a scale. Post-war rebuilding becomes one of the defining tasks of modern London. Damaged housing must be replaced, infrastructure restored, streets repaired, new planning ideas emerge. Some old neighborhoods will never return exactly as they were. Modernist visions begin to influence how the city imagines recovery. There is optimism in this, but also sadness, because rebuilding always means choosing which past to preserve and which to leave behind. St. Paul's, which had survived, remains a symbol. Other landmarks are restored. New housing estates rise. Offices return. Bomb sites gradually become structures again, or parks, or roads, or empty memory held within a changed street line. London after the war is both familiar and strange to itself. And then another modern transformation begins. The old imperial order weakens. The empire recedes. Britain changes. London changes with it. Immigration from former colonies reshapes the city's neighborhoods. Cuisine, music, languages, and social life. The London of the later 20th century becomes more openly multicultural, more diverse, more layered in fresh ways. This is not without tension, because London has never accepted change without complaint. But it is one of the city's great strengths that people from elsewhere continue to arrive and make it new again. At the same time, the welfare state expands certain forms of security. The National Health Service, post-war housing, educational reforms, and new public institutions help reshape ordinary life. Not evenly, not perfectly. London remains unequal because it would hardly know itself otherwise. But the city is no longer simply imperial capital or industrial giant. It is becoming a global modern metropolis whose identity depends less on ruling the world and more on gathering it. By the 1960s, another kind of energy floods the city. Fashion, music, art, youth culture, the famous swinging image of London. All of it adds bright motion after decades of austerity and damage. Carnaby Street flashes with style. King's Road experiments with clothes that seem to mock every older rule. Clubs and venues pulse with sound. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, later Bowie, designers like Mary Quant and Vivienne Westwood, artists, filmmakers, and photographers all help make London feel not merely rebuilt, but newly alive. There is something almost mischievous in that shift. A city that had spent so long in smoke, rationing, and stern endurance suddenly discovers color, pop, risk, and self-invention with adolescent force. It is as if London, having proved it could survive, decides now to see what it can get away with. Yet even in its glamorous moments, the city keeps the memory of harder eras close by. Walk through modern London and the layers remain visible if you know how to look. A church rebuilt after fire, a bombed street line subtly altered, a station that once sheltered civilians under attack, a plaque to the dead, a memorial in a square people now cross while checking messages and hurrying to meetings. This, I think, is part of London's power. It carries memory, not as something sealed away, but as a living underlayer beneath traffic and glass. The city of war and reconstruction never entirely vanishes. It informs the city of finance, fashion, tourism, and global media. The London Eye turns over a river that once carried Roman goods and wartime reflections. The financial towers rise over districts once blackened by smoke and craters. The old and the new are not enemies here. They are roommates who never stop correcting each other's stories. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, London has become again one of the world's defining cities, now less through empire than through finance, culture, migration, media, scholarship, and sheer symbolic weight. It is a place of astonishing diversity and astonishing property prices, which perhaps is the most London sentence possible. It is admired, resented, romanticized, overcrowded, expensive, inventive, and still somehow deeply itself. Look at it now from a bridge over the Thames at evening. The river still takes the light and stretches it long. St. Paul's Dome still holds its place in the skyline. The Houses of Parliament stand with their familiar authority. Modern towers gather glass and sunset. Trains hum. Boats move. Sirens rise and fade. Crowds pour over pavements where Roman feet, medieval merchants, Tudor servants, dock laborers, factory girls, firefighters, pilots, evacuees, and artists all once passed in other clothes under other skies. London has been burned, conquered, bombed, enriched, stained, rebuilt, and reimagined so many times that resilience is no longer merely one of its virtues. It is its native language, and yet the city never speaks that language softly. It speaks it in traffic, construction, argument, reinvention, and the constant pressure of more people arriving with plans. Soon, in the final stretch of this story, we will step back and look at the whole long arc, from Roman crossing to modern metropolis, from wall and tower to skyline and station, and we will ask what exactly has allowed London to remain itself while changing almost beyond recognition. Because the deeper mystery of this city is not that it survives disaster. Many cities do. The mystery is that after each disaster, it somehow returns with a stronger appetite for becoming something larger still. The closer we come to the end of London's long story, the more the city begins to feel less like a place on a map and more like a living habit of survival. It is easy enough to list the ages: Roman, Saxon, Norman, medieval, Tudor, imperial, industrial, wartime. modern. It is easy enough to pin names to walls and dates to kings and disasters and bridges. But if you stand quietly for a moment beside the Thames, especially in the grey light that London seems to invent for itself so effortlessly, you begin to feel that the real continuity is not merely in rulers or buildings. It is in the stubborn human instinct to remain here, rebuild here, bargain here, sing here, bury the dead here, and then begin again. That instinct has been with the city from the beginning. First there was the river, before walls, before cathedrals, before palaces and towers and stations and finance houses and museums. There was the great brown ribbon, moving through mud and reed and weather. The Romans understood what the river offered: crossing, trade, possession, control. They built Londinium because the river made sense, and because sense in an empire often looks like ambition with a measuring tool in its hand. The Roman town rose with all the familiar signs of imperial confidence: roads, bridge, forum, baths, walls, commerce, administration. It became a place where the empire could count and command. Even then, though, Londinium learned its first hard lesson. Cities may be planned, but they are never guaranteed. Boudicca's revolt swept through and burned the settlement fiercely. Fire arrived early in London's education. Yet the Romans rebuilt, because cities with good river crossings are not easily abandoned by practical people. Then the empire receded. Roman authority weakened. Structures decayed. The old order loosened its grip. Another city might have vanished into mere archaeology. London dimmed. Yes, but it did not quite disappear. In the Anglo-Saxon and early medieval centuries, life gathered again around the old site and nearby ground. Trade returned. Power returned. The city learned another lesson, just as important as the first. It did not need to remain unchanged in order to survive. It needed only to remain useful, habitable, and desired. That pattern never truly ended. Under the Norman kings, London became more decisively the seat of power. William the Conqueror did not merely occupy England. He anchored authority in stone. The Tower of London rose as warning and fortress, a structure both practical and psychological. Nearby, Westminster grew in spiritual and political significance. A city once shaped by Roman engineers was now being shaped by conquest, administration, and royal ceremony. The medieval city thickened with markets, guilds, churches, dinimo, trade routes, and crowded lanes where every smell and every shout belonged to someone trying to live a little closer to opportunity. If you were walking those streets then, perhaps near Cheapside or Smithfield, you would have found a London both lively and harsh. Bells everywhere, mud underfoot, market cries, smoke from hearths, noble households in one quarter, squalor not far away in another, the church looming over all of it. And still the city grew. The Magna Carta confirmed certain liberties and acknowledged London's importance. Trade widened. Guilds regulated craft and commerce. Westminster Abbey watched kings crowned. The Tower watched prisoners wait. Light and shadow, side by side, as they always seemed to be here. Then came the Tudors, and London took on a sharper brilliance and a sharper danger. The city became theater, court, market, and argument all at once. Henry VIII pulled England away from Rome and dragged London with him through religious rupture, confiscation, anxiety, and redistribution of wealth. Monasteries were dissolved. Churches changed character. Saint Paul's became part pulpit, part symbol, part stage for reforming fervor. The city vibrated with doctrine and suspicion. Ambitious men climbed. Unlucky ones fell. Tudor London could be splendid in the morning and fatal by afternoon. Yet it was also a city of enormous creative life. Theaters flourished. Shakespeare wrote for crowds who wanted wit, grief, love, murder, philosophy, and ghosts, all before supper. The Globe stood by the river, not far from commerce and noise, turning human confusion into art. In that sense, Shakespeare may be one of the most London things that ever happened, because he took a crowded, contradictory world and made language big enough to hold all of it. Then, in 1666, London burned again. The Great Fire remains one of the decisive moments in the city's story, not only because of what it destroyed, but because of what followed. Timbered medieval streets vanished in flame. Churches, homes, markets, and halls collapsed into ash. The old city was wounded so deeply that rebuilding could no longer mean simply replacing what had been there. It had to mean reimagining urban form itself. Christopher Wren and others stepped into that ruin with plans, measurements, and an eye toward something more ordered and more durable. I have always found it strange that London seems to become more fully itself after catastrophe. Not happier, not gentler, but more decisively London. After the fire, brick and stone replaced much that had been vulnerable wood. St. Paul's rose anew. The city reorganized itself without ever becoming fully orderly, which is probably just as well. A perfectly rational London would be intolerable. It would lose too much of its muttering charm. The centuries that followed brought trade on a global scale, empire, industry, and a new urban immensity. The docks swelled. Merchants multiplied. Wealth accumulated. So did smoke. The Industrial Revolution altered the city with such force that older rhythms were bent around steam and iron. Railways tore new lines through space and time. Factories blackened the air. Clerks and laborers, financiers and dock workers, aristocrats and migrants, all were drawn into a metropolis growing too quickly to explain itself to any one person. Victorian London, in particular, feels, when you look at it closely, like an argument between grandeur and misery conducted at enormous volume. There were museums, exhibitions, boulevards, parks, and handsome terraces. There were also slums, disease, child labor, pollution, and sharp class division. It produced Dickens because it almost required Dickens. A city so large and unequal needed witnesses as much as it needed drains. And then came the wars. The First World War changed the city by sending its sons outward and bringing the modern threat of aerial attack inward. The Second World War changed it more visibly, with the Blitz carving destruction across neighborhoods, docks, churches, shops, and homes. Londoners sheltered in stations, cleared rubble, fought fires, buried their dead, and emerged again. St. Paul's remained standing. The city endured. Post-war reconstruction followed, and once more, London demonstrated its uncanny habit of turning devastation into another stage of becoming. What fascinates me most is that modern London is not simply the sum of these periods. It is the friction between them. Roman wall stones survive near financial towers. Medieval street patterns feed into modern traffic. Tudor memory haunts palace grounds and courtroom ritual. Wren domes coexist with glass shards of contemporary architecture. Victorian station roofs shelter passengers who tap messages into phones. A city bus passes the site of a vanished gate. A pub carries a name older than the paving around it. London keeps layering itself rather than replacing itself cleanly. That layering is what gives the city its peculiar emotional weather. Walk through London now and you can still feel conquest, plague, commerce, fire, piety, wealth, soot, bombing, migration, reinvention. Not always in explicit ways. Often, it is subtler than that. A curve in a lane. A churchyard tucked where towers now loom. A plaque. A bridge. A surviving fragment of wall. The smell of rain on stone near a building much older than the traffic beside it. The way the Thames still catches evening light under structures built centuries apart and makes them belong to one view. The modern city has all the familiar features of a world capital. Finance, media, tourism, universities, government, art, fashion, migration, luxury, poverty, ambition. It can be exhilarating and absurd in the same minute. It can offer a museum of world treasures and a rent so high it feels like satire. It can stage pageantry with full royal confidence, then immediately descend into delayed trains and muttered annoyance. Honestly, that combination may be its final secret. London never lets majesty remain too majestic for long. It will hand the crown a traffic jam and call it balance. Yet beneath the humor and the surface variety lies a deeper continuity. London survives because it keeps attracting people who believe there is still something to be made here. Romans made a crossing. Merchants made markets. Kings made palaces and prisons. Reformers made arguments. Writers made language. Builders made stations and terraces and cathedrals and glass towers. Workers made wealth. Migrants made neighborhoods newly alive. Survivors made the city after every fire and every bombing. The city keeps inheriting itself from people who arrived into uncertainty and decided to act as if continuance were possible. That is why London does not feel finished, even when one tries to summarize it. It resists completion. Every age thinks it is inhabiting the newest version of the city. But London is too full of echoes for that illusion to last. The old city persists beneath each fresh ambition, sometimes warmly, sometimes accusingly. One generation celebrates progress, another mourns what progress swept away, and the city stands there, absorbing both reactions with the patience of old stone and the impatience of a commuter at Bank Station. By the late 20th century and into the 21st, London becomes ever more international, more visibly diverse, more entangled with the world's crises and possibilities. Empire fades, but globality remains. The city is no longer the capital of a territorial empire in the old sense, yet it is still deeply connected to global finance, migration, diplomacy, culture, and inequality. It receives people from former colonies and from everywhere else. It speaks in many languages now, perhaps more honestly than ever. It contains astonishing privilege and severe hardship. It hosts royal weddings and political protests, fashion weeks and transport strikes, hedge funds and food banks, opera houses and corner shops, libraries and night buses, and every shade of aspiration in between. And through all of that, the river keeps moving. I like that detail more the older the story gets. The Thames is not sentimental. It does not stop for coronations, or invasions, or exhibitions, or elections, or war. It carries Roman timber and medieval filth and Tudor reflections and industrial runoff and wartime fire glow and modern tourist boats with equal calm. It is London's first witness and perhaps its only witness that never tries to flatter the city. If you follow the river at dusk, from Westminster toward the city or eastward past old docklands, you can almost read the whole narrative in silhouette. Domes and spires, warehouses and glass towers, bridges replacing bridges, old walls beneath office blocks, monuments to victories, memorials to dead civilians, parliament and cathedrals and cranes and apartments and stations. The skyline becomes less a single statement than a debate, centuries all speaking at once, refusing to yield the last word. That is why London matters beyond its monuments. Not because it is simply old, though it is. Not because it has been rich and powerful, though it has. It matters because it shows what happens when a city is forced again and again to answer the same question in different forms. What do you do after the fire? After the conquest? After the plague? After the schism? After the smoke? After the bombs? After the empire? After the promises fail? After the population shifts? After certainty thins? London answers in the same basic way each time. It builds, argues, adapts, remembers unevenly, profits where it can, mourns where it must, and then keeps moving. The city does not always answer nobly. It can be ruthless. It can be vain. It can be cold to the weak and flattering to the powerful. It has housed exploitation as readily as genius. It has enriched itself through violence done elsewhere. It has tolerated injustice while praising liberty. But perhaps that complexity is part of why its history holds attention so fiercely. London is not a moral tale. It is a human one. Untidy, impressive, compromised, resilient, and endlessly revised. Now, as we near the quietest edge of this journey, we can step back from individual eras and simply watch the city breathe. The Roman crossing, the medieval market, the Tudor court, the Wren skyline, the imperial docks, the foggy stations, the Blitz shelters, the post-war cranes, the modern towers, all of them are still present in one way or another, not as museum pieces alone, but as pressures still shaping how London thinks of itself. And perhaps that is the final comfort hidden in the city's long and difficult history. Nothing here lasts untouched, but very little is wholly lost. A wall fragment remains. A street line survives. A story gets retold. A building is restored. A name continues. A habit of endurance passes from one generation to the next without anyone needing to state it formally. It is just there, in the posture of the place. Soon we will let the city settle fully into night, and in that last stretch, we will leave behind the chronology and simply rest with what London has become. A city of memory and motion, of grief and appetite, of smoke and light on water, still unfinished, still restless, still listening for the footsteps of everyone who ever crossed its bridges and believed, for one reason or another, that life could continue here tomorrow. Now the city is quieter, not silent, because London is almost never silent, but quieter in the way a room becomes quieter after a long conversation when everyone present has said the most important things and only the fire remains to speak in little settling sounds. We have followed the city from mud and timber to stone and glass, from Roman ambition to modern unease, from crown and conquest to commerce and culture, from flames to rebuilding more times than any place should reasonably be asked to endure. And yet, London endures. At the end of such a long history, I think the temptation is to look for a final meaning, one noble sentence that explains why this city lasted while other cities dimmed, why it gathered such power, why it continued to draw people back after war, fire, plague, smoke, and loss. But cities are not sermons, and London least of all. It does not reduce politely. It sprawls. It contradicts itself. It hoards memory and rushes forward at the same time. It is old stone and wet pavement, royal procession and missed train, Shakespeare and scaffolding, incense and diesel, velvet and brick dust. Perhaps that is precisely why it lingers so strongly in the mind. London has always been more than a capital. It is a vessel that keeps receiving the weather of history and somehow remaining afloat. Sometimes damaged, sometimes ugly, sometimes magnificent, often all three at once. The Romans built with confidence and calculation. The medieval city crowded itself with trade, prayer, noise, and danger. The Tudors wrapped power in silk and threat. The 17th century burned and rebuilt. Empire expanded. Industry thickened. War scarred. Art flourished. Migrants arrived. Towers rose. And still, the city never quite became only one thing. If you were to gather all the Londons that have existed and set them beside one another, they might not even agree on who they are. Roman Londinium would probably look at the modern city with disciplined bewilderment. Medieval London might find the gleaming towers both miraculous and morally suspicious, which, to be fair, is still how many Londoners look at them now. Tudor London would admire the drama and ask whether the gossip has improved. Victorian London would likely approve of the railways, complain about certain manners, and then promptly write a long novel about the whole experience. That is the charm of the city. It feels less like one identity and more like a long argument carried forward over centuries. But arguments need common ground, and London has always had its constants. The river is the first. The Thames does not merely pass through the city. It organizes it, divides it, joins it, reflects it, and reminds it of its own age. Stand beside the river almost anywhere, near Westminster, by the South Bank, beneath Tower Bridge, along quieter stretches where office blocks thin and old wharves still haunt the edge of things, and you feel the city loosening just enough to reveal its continuity. The water has seen everything and offers no dramatic opinion. It carries dusk the same way it once carried barges. War, reflections, merchants, cargoes, and ash. Bridges are another constant. Not the same bridges, of course, but the need to cross. Again and again. A city built around crossing learns something profound. That one shore is never quite enough. That life depends on movement between places, class, districts, purposes, and moods. London is full of crossings. Physical, social, historical. River to river. Old to new. Wealth to want. Ceremony to survival. Every bridge in the city feels like a quiet reminder that separation and connection are never far apart. Then there are the bells. Even now, fewer perhaps in authority than they once were, but still present. Church bells, clock bells, the measured sound of time passing through a city that has repeatedly tried to build faster than time itself. You hear them and remember that long before the engines, the stations, the stock exchange, the air raid sirens, the club music, the traffic, there were communities arranged around those chimes. Births marked, warnings given, deaths mourned, services called. Bells remain a soft grammar beneath the city's harder speech. I have always loved how London lets these older notes survive within modern noise. It would be easier, perhaps, for a city of this scale to erase itself every century and start over in whatever style feels newest. But London does not do that. It keeps relics not only as decoration, but as proof that change happened here, not somewhere else. Roman masonry, near office workers, medieval lanes feeding into shopping streets, Wren churches tucked between later facades, war memorials beside bus stops, a pub older than the state of many countries, a station tiled and humming where once frightened civilians slept through bombing raids. This refusal to lose all earlier selves makes the city emotionally dense. You can walk through it on an ordinary afternoon and pass several centuries before you finish your coffee. And what of the people, the ones who made and remade all this? That, in the end, may be the true history. Not only kings and conquerors, architects and generals, queens and prime ministers, though they all leave marks. The deeper history belongs also to masons, ferrymen, scribes, fishmongers, laundresses, actors, dock workers, printers, merchants, nurses, clerks, shopgirls, firefighters, train conductors, migrants, children in shelters, widows in black, laborers on scaffolds, teachers, bakers, night watchmen, market porters, stone carvers, bus drivers, singers, and those anonymous souls who simply got up in cold rooms and did what had to be done so the city could remain alive another day. London has always depended on people who were not being immortalized at the time. Think of the Roman engineers driving piles into river mud for the first bridge. The medieval apprentices rising before dawn to open a stall. The women carrying water in lanes too narrow for comfort. The printers setting type in the age of religious danger. The laborers clearing ash after the Great Fire. The seamstresses, coal heavers, and crossing sweepers of the industrial city. The families descending into underground stations with blankets during the Blitz. The post-war builders putting brick upon brick into streets that still smelled faintly of dust and burnt timber. The new arrivals from Jamaica, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Poland, Bangladesh, Ireland, and everywhere else, carrying recipes, prayers, music, jokes, habits, and hope into neighborhoods that would be changed by them forever. Without these people, there is no London, only a sequence of official events beside a river. The city's greatness, if one must use that word, lies not just in monuments, but in endurance diffused across millions of ordinary acts. A market opening on time after political upheaval, a church repaired after fire, a train running after a night raid, a school resuming, a shopkeeper sweeping glass, a community pulling food, a writer observing, a singer performing, a mason setting stone, a child learning the city's rhythm by following an older hand through a crossing. London is made of repetitions as much as revolutions. That may be why it feels so intimate despite its scale. The grand history is enormous, but the lived history is granular. Wet steps, soot on cuffs, candle wax, river mist, ale and bread, ink and ledger dust, coal smoke in curtains, the stale warmth of train compartments, the hush of museum galleries where imperial trophies now sit beneath explanatory text. The bitter smell after rain on old paving, the gold blur of evening through Westminster windows, the strange peace of a churchyard hidden among offices. These details matter because they soften the story. They turn history from parade into presence. And presence is what London has in abundance. Some cities charm by beauty alone, others impress by order. London rarely relies entirely on either. It is more compelling than beautiful, more layered than harmonious. It can look drab until a certain light touches stone. It can seem harsh until music leaks from a doorway or flowers appear at a market stall or sunset catches the dome of St. Paul's and makes it float for a moment above the whole business of modern living. The city rewards patience. It withholds its tenderness until you have paid attention. Maybe that is why so many people love it in a stubborn way rather than a simple one. It is not easy, not cheap, not always kind, not always fair. Yet people continue to choose it, or to forgive it, or to be unable to leave it fully behind even when they do go. The city makes room by not really making room at all, by forcing lives close together until influence becomes unavoidable. That closeness creates friction, but also invention. London has always been a city where strangers share weather, transport, danger, and possibility. Out of that uneasy shared condition comes much of its power. As we look forward from here, the old questions remain. Climate, inequality, technology, housing, memory, belonging. London is still under pressure. Perhaps that too is part of continuity. The city that survived invasions, fires, imperial overreach, industrial upheaval, and bombing is now asked to survive another set of forces. Some slower, some more abstract, some deeply modern, but no less real. Rising water, overheated summers, unaffordable homes, fractured politics, surveillance, loneliness in crowds, glittering capital beside food insecurity. All of these belong to the current chapter. And yet, I suspect London will answer, as it always has. Imperfectly, argumentatively, creatively, unevenly. It will build some things it should not have built, preserve some things almost by accident, produce movements, protests, plans, scandals, songs, and solutions in the same decade, perhaps in the same street. It will disappoint. It will astonish. It will continue to attract people who want to test themselves against its scale, and people who simply need a place to start again. That last part feels important. London has always been a city of beginning again. Again after the revolt. Again after Rome. Again after conquest. Again after plague. Again after fire. Again after industrial cruelty. Again after the bombs. Again after each wave of change that threatened to make the familiar city vanish. The skyline shifts. The languages multiply. The powers change. The neighborhoods rise and fall. Yet the core habit remains. Begin again. There is comfort in that. especially at night. So perhaps now we can let the story settle. Imagine the city after rain. The streets are still shining. The bridges hold their lamps in long, trembling lines above the dark water. The dome of St. Paul sits pale against the sky. Somewhere, a late train moves. Somewhere, a bell marks the hour. Somewhere, a river bus leaves a brief wake that breaks the lights apart and then lets them gather again. A woman closes a shop. A cleaner crosses an office floor. A baker starts the first work of morning before morning has properly arrived. A taxi turns through a street that once knew horses, then carts, then buses, now sirens and bicycles and footsteps from every corner of the world. The old city is still here, not intact, not pure, but present. Under pavement there is Roman ground. Beyond facades there are medieval lines. In towers there is imperial memory. In stations there are wartime echoes. In markets there is the old appetite. In law courts, theaters, churches, pubs, terraces, embankments, parks, and council blocks there are traces of every age we have walked through together. None of them gone. None of them complete. All of them resting inside the one city that continues to move. And perhaps that is enough. Not a perfect ending, because London does not believe in perfect endings. Only continuations. Only the river after dark. Only the next crossing. Only the sense that a city, like a life, is made not by avoiding damage, but by carrying memory forward without letting it harden into stillness. So let the traffic soften now in your thoughts. Let the bells grow faint. Let the bridges empty. Let the great old city rest beneath its moving clouds and scattered lights. Let Roman wall and Tudor stone and Victorian soot and wartime dust and modern glass all settle into one long hush beside the water. The story is still going on, of course. It always will be. But for tonight, we can leave London there, breathing slowly beside the Thames, old and unfinished, wounded and luminous, proud and ordinary, as if history itself had found a place to lie down and listen to the river. Good night.